let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on trust and social cohesion and why employee engagement isn't enough. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping. If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask as we go through the webinar, please do pop them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we can answer them at the end or as we go through if we have time. So I'm going to get started straight away. So the question that we're looking to answer today really is, what do engagement scores, what is trust and social cohesion and team cohesion? What do engagement scores really tell us? That I had a bad commute into the office and now I'm a bit annoyed, that I fell out with my friend at the weekend and it's my fault because I'm grumpy, that I'm annoyed with my manager because he made someone redundant this morning and I don't know why. That one's taken from my own experience, but not in my current role. Often engagement surveys tell us that people want more money and more flexibility, and that's okay to a point. Engagement doesn't tell us anything about team relationships, connections to colleagues, connections to the leadership team or the organisation. It doesn't tell you whether I believe in what you as an organisation are trying to achieve or whether I'm just taking my salary every month. And it doesn't give you enough data to make decisions and drive actions. MyPeople are experts in measuring the psychological factors that affect team performance. Have you ever been impacted by a decision that was made without all the facts and affected your whole team? Did it lead to mistrust in the decision, mistrust in the process, or even worse, mistrust in the people? We take the guesswork out of teams and enable confidence and fairness in people and decision making by allowing you to unlock the value of trust in your business. The successful organisations that we've worked with have learned that performance is unsustainable without trust. Measuring that trust, along with performance and capability, became part of our DNA through our work with GB Cycling, GB Rowing and England Rugby. So introducing your speakers today, my name's Wendy Kilgannon and I'm the sales manager here at MyPeople. I'm joined by Hughes, CEO and psychologist, who's worked with a number of elite teams over the course of his career, including the aforementioned GB Cycling and England Rugby. Hi, Christian.
Good afternoon, everyone. So how are you and your teams performing right now? Are your teams thriving or just surviving? COVID-19 has created new problems for teams. Performance visibility is poor and visibility of productivity is worse. What do I mean by that? Well, we use performance measurement to track whether we are delivering. And the common approach now in HR is to use engagement to measure sentiment. Both of these are output measurements. They are the result of something. And in the case of engagement, they leave us blind and unable to turn that sentiment into a why, to be able to take a decision. In order to do that, we need input measurements.
So what's happening now? No one's starting with the objective of just surviving. We're all aiming to thrive, but the current situation has left many individuals and businesses in survival mode. We've had lots of things taken away from us that we've previously taken for granted. And whilst the current situation has happened very rapidly, the same factors are at play in our business lives as if it had happened over a period of time. Our connection with our colleagues has weakened. We're finding it more and more difficult to find things outside of work to discuss, mainly because there are very few things other than work that we're doing. We're becoming more and more siloed within groups. We can't see what other teams and departments are doing, and we can't just walk across the office to find out. It's really easy to dehumanise people when they're behind a computer screen, and then the silos become more and more ingrained. There's also a lack of shared purpose and unity. One thing that all the thriving teams we've worked with have in common is a shared goal or purpose, but at the moment, it's really easy for this to become lost in the noise. Finally, we have less opportunity for emotional connections with people, less opportunity to share and download our worries and concerns. When I think about my own experiences, when I was a student, I used to work in a call centre. And I can't tell you the number of times I would take a really difficult call, then walk and get a drink in the kitchen, have a conversation with someone, have a break and discuss that experience. The person I was discussing with it understood, they'd had a similar call, they could empathise with me. But this conversation is no longer available to us without a real purpose, specifically phoning someone. And it means that we're carrying and managing these worries and issues alone. And it also means that it's contributing to the weakening of connections with others. We can't physically see these relationships and connections, but they are tangible, and we do notice when they start to slip away from us. I'm sure most of us can recall a time when we've worked somewhere where some or all of these things were lacking. We can remember how that felt, the way it meant we felt about the organisation and its impact on our ability to do our role. And the impact of all that is a lack of trust. And ultimately, a lack of trust will result in your teams underperforming.
The problem we face as team managers, team leaders, and people interested in teams is there is not enough insight in your teams to identify issues early. Engagement gives a retrospective feeling, a retrospective report on the sentiment within your business. It doesn't tell you why. So where are your teams now? Teams with low trust before COVID-19 are in a high risk category. But what does a low trust team look like? Chances are you may have seen some of these patterns before. A low trust team doesn't share knowledge. They hide their mistakes. They are not collaborative, are not problem solving. Their energy is invested in protection, not in growth. What does performance look like for a low trust team? Interestingly, it might not be as you expect. Sometimes there can be high performers in low trust teams. The trouble is individual performance can mask low trust, and individual performance can be one-off, it can be inconsistent, and it's not team performance, all of which means it's not sustainable. What about high trust teams? Or even teams with high trust before are at risk of a drop-off. What does a high trust team look like? Well, you're going to see high discretionary effort, so a willingness to help each other and go the extra mile. You're going to see people challenging each other and receiving challenges because they're in a shared purpose, wanting to get better, wanting to deliver. These are teams that are going to be sharing, problem solving, and everyone will have a voice. And yet it is dynamic. Trust is a resource. It can be used up. To give you an example of this, I'm just going to talk you through a short story with England Rugby that we experienced. From 2015 to 2017, England Rugby went on an 18-game winning streak, equaling the world record for the amount of successive wins by a national rugby team. That was 2 years of not losing. But when they lost game 19, old patterns resurfaced. The last major disappointment the bulk of this team had and had shared was at the 2015 World Cup, where England were booted out in the group stages. They were lambasted by the press, and a lot of disharmony came from that experience as a group. Now, faced with their first disappointment in 2017, their first loss in 2 years, they reverted back to those old habits: blame, recrimination, arguments. This led to a drop in trust, and they lost a sequence of games on the bounce. Eventually, we had a range of sessions with psychologists specifically brought in to build out communication frameworks so the teams could understand how to process disappointment.
So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Simon Sinek, but if not, he's someone that's worked with elite teams and has done a lot of research into the factors that influence performance in teams. And I thought this quote was really appropriate to what we're discussing today, where he says, "A team is not a group of people that work together. A team is a group of people that trust each other."
The good news, team visibility and actionable insights are possible. In order to do that, though, we've got to change the way in business we measure teams. We have to move away from or supplement our engagement outputs and start measuring input measurements. And that starts with measuring trust. Now, trust might seem like an intangible quality, but actually we've managed to measure it over the last 20 years. We've had 20 years of elite sport experience where we've had a unique insight into what psychological factors impact performance and how to measure them. And we've refined it down to 3 things: team relationships, team behaviors, and team goal alignment. So in team relationships, that's teams working for each other. In team behaviors, sharing the same values and working within the same behavioral framework. And team goal alignment. So that is shared purpose. That is the shared direction of the team. And we call this BAR. And so setting the bar high is about behaviors, alignment, and relationships. And just to give you an insight into how quickly that can be built, in our work with the British and Irish Lions, another rugby team, we have 3 nations that come together to form a team: England, Scotland, and Wales. And for most of the 4 years in between the British and Lions tours, they are battering each other on a rugby pitch. They pretty much hate each other. And then every 4 years, they have to come together to take on the Southern Hemisphere teams and somehow become a team and bond. Using this framework of BAR, of behaviors, alignment, team goal alignment, relationships, that can happen quite quickly. All the exercises in the initial focus for the British and Irish Lions team coaches and management is around getting the behavioural framework shared, getting alignment of purpose, why everybody is there on tour, and working on those relationships, building trust through different bonding exercises and different actions. All of that gets you to a point of a T-score, or a trust score.
So we've talked about relationships, and trust absolutely starts with these relationships. And here at MyPeople, we call that team cohesion. Team cohesion is a connectedness and a solidarity amongst teams, and we're able to measure two different dimensions of this. Someone's sense of belonging to a team and the relationships amongst those team members. And Simon Sinek, I'm sorry, I really like his work. He has another great quote when he talks about this, that we feel like we belong, when we feel like we belong to the group and we trust the people with whom we work, we naturally cooperate to face outside challenges and threats. When we do not have a sense of belonging, however, then we are forced to invest time and energy to protect ourselves from each other. In other words, when we have a sense of team cohesion, we can all work towards a shared goal. When we don't, we spend more time fighting each other than we do working towards the goal. So how do we measure team cohesion?
So this has evolved over 20 years through work with elite sport teams and work with the likes of MIT in the States. We looked at the key statistical factors that influence performance. You'll notice some of the language here is perhaps slightly different from normal HR language. We use the phrase capital a lot, and that is to partly make it easier for a CFO to identify with. But secondly, and more importantly, it's about showing it as a resource that we use. It goes up and it goes down. So we measure people's relationship to different aspects of the business. We measure job capital. So that is how connected you feel to the role that you're doing. Is it something you enjoy and love, or is it something you do for money? Psychological safety. This is the freedom to communicate, to be yourself, be as close to yourself as you think you are. Harvard Business School's research shows that when individuals feel safe to be themselves, they learn and adapt faster. For the team, this makes for the perfect ideas lab, where people are free to share and free to challenge. If you take away that psychological safety, all those ideas get suppressed and you get a yes culture. Social capital, perhaps the most important amongst this group, is this is about the relationships between team members, the quality of those relationships and the support that each individual receives from their team. It's very easy to have a task-based relationship where a task is all that bonds an individual to another individual. It's much deeper and much harder to attain a relationship that's based around other factors, shared interests, shared values, an ability and willingness to share difficulties with your teammates. Leadership capital. So this is the connection to and the support that an individual feels from their leaders. Trust in leaders is imperative to the team's direction. If a group do not feel connected to their leaders, they're very unlikely to follow their leaders in the direction of travel. And finally, organizational capital. This is the connection to the company, and this is about emotion. This is how proud you feel to work for your organization. This is critical to the discretionary effort that you put in teams. So discretionary effort is partly about your team and how you feel about your team, but also around that shared purpose, how you feel about the organization and what the organization is trying to do. So if you measure team now, what are you going to get from that? Well, it's going to provide you with the insight you need to take action early. So instead of having a piece of feedback that tells you that your team has reasonable engagement or is happy or sad, it's very difficult to take any action from that. What team cohesion measurement will do is improve communication, identify silos, build shared purpose and strengthen team bonds, because you'll get insight into where your team is functioning and where it is not. And this leads to thriving teams.
So before you all panic, we can help you. We're offering companies a free team cohesion survey to get you started, and it will give you a baseline so you can understand where you are right now. As part of the survey, you'll get your trust score, which you can track over time. You'll be able to compare your teams with others and use our benchmarking, and we'll highlight areas where there are misalignments and action is needed, including potentially training, performance management, development plans, and communications. And as well as the ability to track any changes on T-score, you can track them as a result of any interventions that you make. All of this will help you build thriving teams. So I guess you probably have questions about how it works. Well, we'll send your team the MyPeople Team Cohesion survey link via email, and we'll collect their responses. We'll then analyse those responses and provide you with a report that is packed with actionable insights, including your T-score and industry benchmarks. And you can then start making any necessary changes and begin to monitor the impact of your T-score on the bottom line. Interested? Well, give us a contact, drop us an email on wendy@mypeoplegroup.com and take the first step in measuring the trust in your organisation today.
But you do not need to stop there. You can continue supercharging your teams. On the 4th of June, which is our next webinar, we're going to take the next circle. So today we've looked at team relationships through the lens of team cohesion. Next, on the 4th of June, we will look at team behaviours. And then finally, we will focus on team goal alignment later on in June. And all of that will give you the basis to start measuring trust.
So any questions? As I said at the beginning, if you've got any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box or in the chat. We've had our first couple of questions already. So Manley has asked, Christian, do you believe continued success could undermine future performance?
I suppose there are issues around complacency and retaining focus. Some of the teams that have managed to achieve performance in sport, especially over long periods of time, have found a way to get motivated each year. I'm thinking of basketball teams like the Chicago Bulls, who won 3 tournaments in a row. I'm thinking of the likes of, unfortunately, Manchester United and Alex Ferguson as a Liverpool supporter. Each year they found a new motivation, a new reason why they wanted to win. I think the teams that perhaps get complacent, when I think about, for example, the England rugby team 18 games in and the state that they were in, there was a lot of, or there were bits of problems bubbling under the surface that were masked by the wins. And there were certainly plenty of games in that 18-game streak, towards the back end of that 18-game streak, where we shouldn't have won. We got lucky, or some element helped us on the day, or we put in a very sterling defensive performance, but our offensive performance was bad. Those wins masked the fact that there were underlying issues bubbling. So I think, yes, achievement and continued performance can create complacency and can mask issues underneath.
Thank you very much, Manley. If you've got any follow-ups, drop them in the Q&A. Another question, Christian, that's 3 in 1, I think. How early in the establishment of a team would you recommend doing the survey? Or alternatively, is there a point where you think the team might have gone too far?
Well, I think you don't need to get very far in a team to start measuring. I actually think that's the optimum. You know, if you've got a team that's just come together, you've suddenly got a baseline if you do the measurement early. Very rarely is that the point at which we get involved in teams, except for the likes of the Lions. But even with the Lions, we have the benchmarks from previous years. So from my perspective, this is absolute mandatory. Perhaps to a lot of the people on the call, these are new measurements and perhaps new ideas. Maybe they're not, but in sport, this is absolute mandatory. And I think in business and high functioning teams, this is sort of mandatory stuff to understand what is influencing performance. Because once you've got that, you can start to predict performance, which is what we're all aiming for.
And the second part to that question is, how quickly would you expect a business to see results?
Yeah, great question. So I think with regards to this team cohesion survey, within 7 to 10 days, the report will be delivered. From there, there's very clear insights that drive action. You'll hear me say this many times for those of you on the call who've spent around a lot of time with me. The difference between insight and information is the ability to take action. If we are collecting information like an engagement survey where we're saying happy and sad, the question I will always be asking is, what are you going to do with that information? And the answer is, there's very little you can do. You might take guesswork around interventions, but what you really want is insight that can tell you where you need to make changes, and then you can monitor whether those changes have worked. So I think if you're looking at doing the team cohesion survey, you're talking about 10 days before you get your insights, and then you can start taking action straight away.
Excellent. And Manley has a follow-up question about the rugby, which says, Japan World Cup final, what happened there?
I have never been asked that question before. Well, firstly, I would say it is very hard for any of the top 4 teams, of which England were at that time, to beat each other week in, week out. And England was the only team that had to play Australia and then New Zealand, so 2 of the 3 back to back. So that is a difficult feat. And I believe if South Africa had the same back to back schedule as England did, they would struggle as well. But I think the approach to the semi-final was very different to what happened in the final. I think a couple of things early on upset the team, and they started to do things they hadn't done anywhere else in the tournament. And somewhere embedded in that team at that time, because I wasn't involved in this specific game, was a belief that they had to do something different in the final, when actually all the way through the tournament, what had got them to the final was not what they tried to do in the final.
And a really good question, I think, here. How often do I need to do this measurement? Is it weekly, monthly, 6 monthly?
Yeah, great question. It depends a little bit on the size of your teams and the level of surveying you're doing already. So if you are regularly surveying your teams in many areas, I'd suggest this is one way of condensing it down into one survey. I think you should be doing this quarterly at the least. You could do this monthly, but more than that, for this type of survey, I would say it's more of a monthly measure. I would try and align it with how often you do your performance measurements. So if you're doing monthly performance goal setting and measuring, put it into there. If you're doing pulse surveying, so every 2 weeks you can fit in parts of the survey into that. But I would try and line it up with your performance management approach.
Do we have any more questions? Seeing a couple of things coming through, but a couple of people typing, I think. Just give people a couple of seconds to type.
One of the questions I get asked most is which is most important. I think we have a obsession in Western way of operating for having one thing that's the important thing. What is it? Which of those is the most important? Is it the behaviours? Is it the alignment? And is it the relationships? And for fun, I change it every time, the answer. But I think the starting point, we've started here with relationships, because the focus on relationships is critical. But within that is shared purpose. So, sorry, there's a batch of questions coming through.
No, there is. So presumably this is even more important now that we're all working remotely. I think I can take that one, absolutely. So that weakening of connections that we were talking about is absolutely even worse now we're working remotely. So as I say, in my experience, when I worked in a call centre, in other jobs that I've done, whenever you have that bad experience, you can go and have a coffee. There's someone there who's done the job, who's had the same experience. When you're all working from home remotely, there's no one to talk to about that, because with the best will in the world, most often than not, your kids or your partner or your housemates don't work in the same role as you. They don't have that shared experience. And because you're not talking to people that you're working with all the time, then it's very difficult to, you have to be very purposeful about calling them to have a conversation about a bad call, and you wouldn't typically do that. Whereas it's just an off the cuff conversation in a kitchen. It's not purposeful when you're kind of have to make a call.
And I might just add to that, we do this for a living every day, and even in our teams, I've noticed little silos cropping up as a result. It sort of comes with labeling. You can notice it with labeling when we've got a range of different teams, but when our developers are referring to our data science team, so the data guys, saying, oh, I haven't heard back from the data guys. Well, that might be 1 or 2 people, and previously they sat next to them, so they would never be called the data guys. They would be called Danilo or David. Suddenly they're the data guys, and the same for the devs. You suddenly notice we're labeling people by accident, really, because we're no longer sitting with them, and that's a really good indication of how silos can form in this environment.
Question here, how is the current situation affecting survey results? Are we seeing a significant breakdown in trust and relationships because of home working?
Yes. Yes, I'd say about a 30-40% drop, even in high performing teams. It's crazy. But it's sort of I don't want to say the word natural because so much is constructed, but it happens without us necessarily noticing. The more the focus on task, the natural impact whilst we're all working from home is that you're getting through your task list without perhaps considering where that task list goes, what happens after you finish your task.
I think some of the things I've seen have been where there was high trust in the first place and and the relationships were very strong. Those still exist, but they're perhaps not as strong as they were because people are used to having conversations every day and they're not happening in quite the same way. Where there was already low trust, it's breaking down quite quickly because there's no emotional scaffolding there to support it. Are team sizes impactful when you are measuring teams?
I think there's some basic rules that are in popular psychology at the moment around team sizes and how you lose connection. The ones that I studied when I was doing my first degree were around there was 7 and 150 were key numbers. 150, the moment you can't remember everyone's name in the team is usually a good indicator that the team size has got to a point where relationships are perhaps less, and they're stretched. So yes, it can impact. It can impact how easy it is to keep close, and what you then tend to get is pockets of groups that work together. But ultimately, we want to see and measure across those groups. So whilst we're talking about teams here and team, this is across the whole organisation. So the simple answer is yes, it can impact the performance of teams and the connection of teams. It doesn't impact necessarily the measurement of teams.
Another one here. Can we have high performance and low trust? You can. Absolutely, you can have high performance and low trust. What tends to happen is that performance is not sustained. It's a very short period. And the best sports analogy I can think of for that is in football, where they get a new manager and often it's quite shouty and he gives them a kick up the bum, and that performance improves for a period of time, but that motivational technique only works for a short period of time, and then the performance will drop off again because they don't trust he has the ability to lead them in the correct way.
Absolutely. For my sins, when I left sport, I started working with a range of private equity firms who were buying businesses, and they had a model and an approach to get a short-term gain from the businesses that they had bought and then sell them on. And they would push everybody very hard. They would reduce the headcount within the business by 20 or 30%. And this was a very aggressive private equity firm. I'm not suggesting this is common. But the result was, for short periods, so 12, maybe as much as 18 months, you could get performance out of the group. But the trust levels dwindled to such a point where everybody started attacking each other. And then the numbers started to drop and people started covering up mistakes. And suddenly the leadership group couldn't see clearly how the performance was happening or whether it was happening because it was being masked. I can think of countless examples of that. So it's very hard to have a high-performing team with low trust for very long.
There's another question here, which I think specifically relates to the team cohesion survey that we talked about, which is what actions will I be able to take from the information from the survey?
So the survey will give insight across those 5 areas, from job capital, psychological safety, social capital, leadership capital, through to organizational capital. It will prioritize where there are weaknesses, and it will give you insight around what solutions you might want to deploy or what you might want to further investigate. The actions that typically come out of this sort of team cohesion survey are things like development plans, training. I've seen some team reorganization, change in performance management approaches, change in goal setting approaches, change in hiring approaches. So starting to look at the dynamic of the team when hiring, so different cultural fit aspects coming into the hiring process. So they can be wide ranging. If you think about all the things you can do with people and all the mechanisms within which we try to improve our business using people, all of them are touched by this team cohesion survey.
So last question for now. So if anyone's got any more, pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. I really like the call out around trust, not just being in your own team, but trusting in other teams and how that can lead to silos if it doesn't exist. Is this a different type of trust? And if so, is it measured differently?
No, it's all trust. The trust, sort of, we would call that inter-team trust. The challenge of any organization is, once you have trust in one team, is having that across the whole organization and each team, and then having inter-team trust, so that teams trust each other. We also measure the culture of organizations, and what we typically find is you get 5 or 6 cultures within an organization, so you, in effect, subcultures rather than one culture, which just goes to indicate how silos form naturally. Maybe this links back to the question earlier about team sizes, is that our natural human point of connection is in certain group sizes. Inter-team trust, of course, is imperative. If the finance team doesn't trust the HR team or vice versa, you're going to get miscommunication. One will be demonized by the other, and then you start to get the inability to actually connect anymore, because one is at fault for everything. All you can see in those scenarios is why that team isn't doing what they should be doing. And so you're now lost all sort of objectivity. In sport terminology, we would say performance bias is now crept in. You're not seeing, I can't tell you how many times I've shared a video of a game with a player, and they see the game completely differently to what the video is showing. And that's with an objective piece of information. Here we're talking about even more subjective things. So the point here being, the moment we start to lose trust in other teams and demonize them, rather than trying to ask, where are they coming from? What's that about? How can I see it from their perspective, is the point at which we then start to lose trust and then performance across teams.
So I haven't seen any more questions come in. So just give you guys a couple of seconds if anyone wants to add any more. But just a reminder that our next webinar is going to take place on the 4th of June, same time, 2 o'clock, where we're going to be looking at team behaviours. So how a team behaves and the kind of values and behaviours in a team. If you're interested in having an understanding of your trust score in your organisation and in your team, do drop us an email, wendy@mypeoplegroup.com. I'll leave that up there. I'll also send it out in the post-event email that goes out, which probably coming out tomorrow. And in there as well will be a recording of the event and the link to register for the next webinar. Can't see any more questions coming in. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. Really appreciate it. I hope this has been useful for you, and look forward to seeing you on the 4th of June.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers. See you all again.